All right. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, everybody, for coming out today. My name is David G. I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic and a grateful recovering sexaholic. I have a sobriety date in AA of August 8th, 1994, and I have a sobriety date in SA of October 1st, 2019. I'm real grateful to have been doing the book studies through these weeks. I'm just very grateful for you guys for coming out, and you've just really helped me to stay sober a day at a time, and I thank you so much for that. We've been in the first step all these weeks. We went through the forwards. We got into the doctor's opinion. We looked at Bill's story. There is a solution, more about alcoholism, and that covered step 1. Now, step 2 is contained in chapter 4. Throughout the whole chapter is dedicated to step 2, we agnostics. So, they've always told me that, I was powerless for 2 reasons. Once I started to drink, I could not stop. Once I stopped, I could not stay stopped. And it was the same way with my acting out. So if I'm powerless, then obviously my answer has to be power. And if insanity is what's driving me out over and over, then sanity has to be the answer to that. So in this chapter, we're going to look at step 2. We came to believe that a power, not in a power, but that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I'll tell you why I say that. A lot of people say, why do you say that? Because the book talks a lot about believing in a power greater than ourselves as well. And yes, it does. But I think many of us come to this program being an agnostic because an agnostic is someone who does believe. He does believe in the existence of a power greater than himself, God, whatever you choose to call it. However, like most of us, we never choose to call on that power. We never trust that power, and we never acknowledge that power, but it doesn't mean that we don't believe. So we're looking to come to believe that a power, not any power, could restore us to sanity. So when we look at the word agnostics, we need to look at it in 2, breaking it into parts. The word gnostics by itself, all the way back to its original roots, means knowledge. And if you put ag in front of any word, it means without. So really the word agnostic means without knowledge. And now as an 8-year-old boy, living here in the South, I was made to go to a Pentecostal church growing up. There was something inside of me that rebelled from that forever. And I can remember them telling me things in that church, like if you do certain things, you're going to die and go to hell. And that scared me a lot. And one day I was sitting there and I remember them saying something to the effect, if you even think about doing these things, you're going to die and burn in hell. Now that might not have been what they said, but that's exactly what I heard. And it scared me to death. So I turned away from that idea of God. And like this chapter is going to say, with turning away from that idea, I imagine I had abandoned God altogether. Now, as I got older and I began to drink and drug and act out and do the things that I do, there wasn't a lot of serious consequences in the beginning. So my thought was they lied to me from the beginning. So I'm going to do what I want to do from now on. So that's exactly what I did. So whenever I came in to Alcoholics Anonymous in 1994, I come in with a knowledge of an 8 to a 10-year-old boy about God. Now, I can't take those ideas that from back in all those years ago and make them work today, but that's exactly what I tried to do. And what happened was I ended up getting in a whole lot of trouble, and it took me a long time to get a good, solid conception of a power greater than myself. So we're going to start with chapter 4, We Agnostics, this week. We're going to look at the book. We're going to look at some things that I feel is pretty interesting. There's about 3 different exercises throughout this chapter, the way that I was taken through it. Now, if that's not the way you've done it, I completely understand. As I always say, your sponsor is right, not me. I think that you should do it the way he does it, but I want to share with you the way that it was done with me. So looking at that, we'll start right here in the beginning where he says, in the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. Now, we hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non, and we looked at that several times in those first 3 chapters. He says, if when you honestly want to, you find that you cannot quit entirely. Now, we know that's because of the mental obsession. Or if when drinking or acting out, you have little control over the amount you take. We've seen that was because of the physical allergy. We looked at that in depth in the doctor's opinion, and we looked at that all the way up to page 23 in this book. It says you're probably alcoholic. I have a lot of people come to me today and they say, David, do you think I'm an alcoholic? Do you think I'm a sexaholic? And I say, I don't know. But let me ask you just a couple of questions. Have you ever honestly wanted to quit and find out you could not? Or if when you were doing what you did you have a little control over the amount you take? And they say, well, yes. I say, then you're probably alcoholic, sexaholic, or whatever it is. Now, I know that they have taken these and they've added it into 10 questions, and then later on they put it into 20 questions. And it seems like some time after that, they've even turned it into 44 questions, a pamphlet. Thank God when Ebby came to Bill, he didn't have 44 questions. He was able to ask him just a couple of things. Bill was able to identify. And that's how we are here. That's what we're looking at today. So the book says, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, my mind already begins to close here whenever my sponsor was taking me through this book. But what's needed here is a spiritual experience to conquer a spiritual disease. So to one who feels that he's an atheist or an agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic or a sexaholic death, that's step one. Or to live on a spiritual basis, that's step two. Are not always easy alternatives to face. And the biggest reason that that's so hard is because I don't know how to do it. I've come back in here with the mindset of an 8-year-old boy. But look what the book says. It isn't so difficult. About half of our original fellowship were exactly of that type. So that tells me that at least 50 of them in the beginning was exactly of the type that I was when I came here. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. And I think that's the case for each one of us. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you. But cheer up, something like half of us thought that we were atheists or agnostics. And just because we thought that, as we learn about our thinking more as we go through this chapter and the others, we'll see that the biggest part of that's not true anyway. It says our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Now, if a mere code of morals or better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism or sexaholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. A lot of us do have pretty good philosophies of life and morals in different areas, but for some reason in this particular illness for myself, it doesn't do any good. We found that such codes and philosophies did not save us no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power was not there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed us utterly. So here's my problem. My powerlessness is exactly what's wrong with me. My problem is not lust. My problem is not alcohol. My problem is not drugs. It's not any of those things. My problem is lack of power. That was our dilemma, period. We had to find a power by which we could live, not just be sober, but live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously, but where and how were we to find this power? Now, as we journey through this chapter, we get over to page 55 in this book, we're going to see exactly where to find him, and we're going to see exactly how to find him. But look at this key paragraph right here. That's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable me to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. Not enable you to solve your problem, not send you to somebody to solve your problem, not to go anywhere to solve your problem. The main object of this book is to enable us to find a power greater than ourselves. This power will solve the problem, period. What a great promise. So that means that we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral, and it means, of course, here we're going to talk about God. Now, here difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought that he had neatly invaded or entirely ignored. I can remember I'd been to treatment many, many times, but the first time that I went, I can remember going to a meeting, my very first meeting. And at the end of that meeting, they all circled up and they held hands and they began to say the Lord's Prayer. And it just about made me sick, literally. I thought, my God, that's where they're going with this. This thing is going to be about God, and I just can't do that. Because the idea that came back to me was the idea I had as an 8-year-old boy in that Pentecostal church. So I loved their fellowship. I loved the way they talked. I loved the camaraderie they had. But when they brought in the God deal, there was just something on the inside of me that felt very sick. So the book says, we know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. And I can remember being this way even after going to the meetings for a little while. And I would hear you good people talk about God and talk about other things and what God had done in your life. And I would become so violent on the inside. And there were times that I would say things in the meetings that would just be horrible to different members about their idea of God. And thank God through the years that has changed. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. That's exactly what happened to me. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. I can remember being locked up in 1987 for a drug offense. And I can remember them bringing little Bibles around. There were Gideons that come by and they would bring little Bibles. And it just made me so mad. I got so violent with that. I can remember throwing one on the floor and just saying, the first man that picks that up, I'm going to kill you in this cell. And it was just unreal at the things that we would do. We were going to tattoo a cross on the bottom of our foot so that we could walk on the cross of God all of our lives. I mean, I just hated anything that had to do with this idea of God. It was just sickening. Thank God for this chapter. Thank God for this chapter. Page 46. It says, we were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. And that's exactly how I felt. We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological system, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked asking at many individuals who claimed to be godly. I can remember going to church and hearing the preacher preach, and I just think, that guy, he's worthless. And I was a young boy. I mean, my God, I was a young boy at that time. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it at all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments, we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. And right here, I usually stop with the guys that I work with through this book. And we take a look at some of those moments that have been fleeting and soon lost in our life. The book says some of them were enchanted by a starlit night. That didn't really happen to me. One of the examples that I remember, and I'd shared this the other day, my wife and I had went to the Grand Canyon, and we were standing out over it, looking over it. It was just one of the most beautiful things that I'd ever seen. And I was just standing there, and I had what they call an aha moment or a God moment, and it was just beautiful. And the very next thought that came to mind was, if you get too close to the edge of this, you're going to fall off and kill yourself. That thought come in and stole that experience from me that quick. And that's happened over and over. So really what the book is asking me to do here is I need to see where that's happened whenever I'm walking with God. I'm in this recovery process. I'm doing good. I'm staying sober. I'm not acting out with lust. I'm not drinking. I'm not doing what I'm doing. And all of a sudden a thought comes in and takes over that and completely steals that experience away from me. And the next thing you know, I'm back on the internet, or I'm back doing what I'm doing one more time. And here we go with relapse again and again. So I pay close attention to this. I don't know about you, but I like to take a few moments to reflect on this and just see what your experience may have been with this. Have you ever had such a peaceful moment that nothing around you mattered, but all of a sudden something slipped in and took that away? And that's our ego. That's the disease. So if you would, let's just take a minute or so here and let's do that. And then at the end, whenever we're in the question part of it, I'd really love to hear your experience, strength, and hope with that. Could we do that for just a minute?
It is at this moment that the participants went around the room and shared some of their spiritual experiences. We will now resume the presentation.
Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you we found as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice, and remember, anytime we see that word, we're going to be looking at old ideas of God, prejudged ideas. We're not looking at the color of skin or anything like that as far as prejudice. We're looking at old ideas. Now, my old ideas as an 8-year-old boy did not work for me as a grown man when I came into this program, so those had to be set aside. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results. What a beautiful promise right there. Even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. And one of the things I'd always said, if I could understand God, I would be God. So when I come to the rooms and I hear people say God as I understand God, that was very confusing to me. I can remember talking with my sponsor about that, and I said, I don't understand God. And he said, well, I don't either. Why would you make a statement like that? And I said, because I go to meetings and I hear it all the time, God as I understand God. But as I move into the third step, we're going to talk about God as we understood God, not as I understand God. And what I understood when I first came here was different than what I understood 2 years later. And 5 years later, I understood something different. 10 years and 15 and 20 and now a little over 25 in AA. I still continue to have understood more and more, but I do not understand God. So the book says, much to our relief, we discovered that we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and effect a contact with him. I don't know if I've ever effected a contact with him before this work. I prayed, I'd done those things. I was rebellious through those years, but never had I made the approach and effected the contact with him. The very next page is going to show me exactly how to do that. But here in the South, you don't come up with your own idea of God. You don't create who God is. You either believe as they believe or you go to hell, and that's what they've taught us as kids. And, that scared me. So when I came here and what we read, it said, much to our relief, we discovered we didn't need to consider another conception. Our own conception, it was, however inadequate, was sufficient. And I just thought, man, you can't do that. You cannot do that. But, thank God that you can do that. See, I don't ever change who God is. Nobody can do that. But we can change what our conception of God is. And that's what the book is asking me to do, because that's what has me blocked. So look at what he says. He says, as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe, and if you'll hold that spot there for just a second, and let's flip back over here to page 12 for just a second, we're going to see that why Bill uses that kind of writing, because he used it there on page 12 in his story when he said this: despite the living example of my friend, talking about Ebby Thatcher, they remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. That was intensified in me as well on page 46 here, because that's what it's fixing to ask me to do. He says, I didn't like the idea I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of the czar of the heaven, however loving his sway may be. And then if you come back to page 46, that's exactly what they're going to ask us to do here. If my old idea of this power has not worked for all of these years, then maybe I need a new idea of what that is. And as soon as I do that, look at the promises that follow that. Here at the bottom, where he said, as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, spirit of the universe, underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed. What a word, possessed, not of our obsession anymore, but of this new sense of power and directions. But there is a condition, and here it is: provided we take other simple steps. In other words, 3 through 12. Now, we found that God does not make too hard of terms to those who seek him. To us, the realm of the spirit is broad and roomy. So the realm of the spirit, we're going to learn over on page 55 in this book, lives within me. What a heck of a place to put it. That's why I can never find it, because I've looked everywhere but here for it. Now, if the realm of the spirit is within me, and today I believe that to be true, then that means that there's a God personal to me. And if I can make a conscious contact with this God that's personal to me, then I don't need your conception. I don't need the Pentecostal churches. I don't need anybody's conception of a power greater than myself. I have it right here inside of me. So my job now is to unblock those things which has had me cut off. And once I do that, the power is going to flow through me, not only to be sober, but to recover. What a beautiful promise. He said to us, the realm of the spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. I wasn't taught that as a child. It is open, we believe, to all men. So when therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. And that applies to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. And there's going to be a lot of them coming up. But look at this real close. Do not let any prejudice, any old idea that you have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. Now, this is a spiritual exercise that we use in the book. As I go through this with my guys, the way that it was done with me, we're going to take a look at some spiritual terms which have rubbed me in a very raw way, which has been quite a few actually. And growing up here in the South and in the Bible Belt, you can imagine what it's going to be. Almost all of it is going to be centered around Christianity. So we're going to take a look at an example sheet that Dennis was good enough to draw up for us. And I want to just show you some of my ideas. If this is an exercise that you would like to do for yourself, I really encourage you to do that, because, you know, I've read this book for a lot of years and I never really seen that. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. So are you able to pull that up, Dennis? Okay, if you'll take a look at that, the way I do that is I take a sheet of paper and I draw a line right down the center of it. Now on the left-hand side, I put spiritual terms, and on the right-hand side, I put my conception of what these mean to me. Now, growing up in that church and being opposed against all of that, you can see right there that the word Christ always, when that was mentioned, just rubbed me in a way that was just, oh my God. Now, I don't know if that's your experience or not, but that was mine. What was my conception of that? If I honestly asked myself, what does this mean to me? And I look at that on the right-hand side of that. If that's bothering me so bad, what does that mean to me? Well, when I sat and I took a look at that and I sat with silence for a little bit, punishment and death, that always seemed to circle around that. He got whipped, he got beat, it was my fault, he died for my sins even though I wasn't around. It was death, death. I always heard about death. So that's what it honestly meant to me. One of the other ones that was a big block for me was the Holy Spirit. I felt like he was someone that was always watching me, always judging me, and therefore I tried to drown that out with alcohol and other things in the early days. And then as it escalated into acting out and other things, I felt like he was really watching me then and then really judging me for those things. So I tried to drown that out every time. The word ceremony, I'm Native American, and we do a lot of Native American ceremonies here in Oklahoma. I do sweat lodges and different things. But that is a spiritual term, and I really didn't know what that meant. The only thing that came to me was righteous. Now, the word salvation, the only thing I could come up with was daily walk, eternity now, but death, that was a big one. That was a big one, and that was going to come into my fear list later on in inventory work that we're going to do. But eternal punishment is what I always viewed that as. The hereafter, I don't really know what that means to me. Why is something rubbing me wrong, so wrong that I don't even know why. I don't even really know what that honestly means to me, but for some reason that has me blocked. And of course, the only son, he's God's only son. Well, I had a brother that was older than me, or I have a brother that's older than me, and he has always been the favorite. So the only son idea, I did not like it at all. So to me, that meant favorite. There was no others. He is the favorite. There is no other sons. And that's the way that I felt back then. But look at what the book says now. Let's go back to the book. And right there where we dropped off, it says at the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood him, not as I understand it. So in other words, for the first time in my life, I was able to truly get honest and say, this is the way that I see these things. Now, today I can tell you that my conception on every one of those things that was on the left-hand side of that column are not the same as they was. I held some of those beliefs up. I needed to see what needed to go and what I was able to keep. So look at what he says right here. He says, afterwards, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. Now, I guarantee you, I went to church with my family today, and I sat in there, and I was able to sit there and enjoy that whole service. There was absolutely none of that on the inside of me, screaming and fighting. And there was a lot of talk about Christ and the Holy Spirit and the cross and all those things, and it didn't bother me at all. But at that time, that was a huge block for me. So as he said right there, afterwards we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. So it tells me right there, I've grown. But if we wish to grow, and I do, then we have to begin somewhere. So we use our own conception, however limited it was. And I can remember a guy asking me to sit in silence there one time. He said, I'd like for you to draw a box on a piece of paper. And he said, I would like for you to come up with your own conception of a power greater than yourself. It can't be anything you've ever heard, anything you've ever read, anything that you've ever listened to someone else say. It has to be your conception of a power greater than yourself. And I want to tell you, that box stayed blank for many years. And finally, I had to put something in it. And I had to put something in it that I read out of the book. So it's hard to come up with our own conception of a power greater than ourselves, which someone hasn't already give us an idea about, or it was for me. So let's look at one more paragraph, and then we'll close there for the week, because I'd really like to hear your experience, strength, and hope on this. Look at this paragraph. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe? The agnostic has always been willing to believe, remember? So he's talking about the agnostic there, not the true believer. Do I now believe, the agnostic, or am I even willing to believe, the atheist? See, he can become willing to believe that there is a power greater than myself. As soon as a man can say that he does believe, that's the agnostic, or is even willing to believe, that's the atheist, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. Now, we might not be going anywhere yet, but at least we're on our way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, and remember, step one was the foundation. As we're building this arch, we're going to look at the cornerstones, and that's going to be step two. Look at what it says. A wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. My gosh, I've already got hope in this chapter, and I ain't even been 2 pages into it. So for me, what an eye-opener this chapter has become. Today that there's a difference between faith and trust. When I came here, I had faith that you believe. Today, I absolutely trust that. I trust that in my life. We're going to look at the story of Columbus next week. Here was a man who was rough and tough, and he believed what other people dared not to even mention they believed. And he stood on the seashore, and he talked about that belief over and over and over. He believed that the world was round. It wasn't flat. He didn't believe if you sailed out there so far, you went off the edge. But it didn't matter. As long as he stood there and as long as he talked about that, all it was an idea. All he had was faith. That's not enough for us. We need action to go with it. Belief without any action is just a belief, and that's not good enough. I have to believe that something greater than me can restore me to sanity. There are a lot of people in my life that have been a power greater than myself. I stood in front of the judge one time, and he had the power to put me away for over 20 years. He was definitely a power greater than me. I've been in surgeries a few times from fighting and all the stuff that I've done. They were definitely a power greater than me. I was fixing to go under the blade. Lust is a power greater than me. Alcohol is a power greater than me. But not one of those can restore me to sanity. So it don't matter how many power greater than me that there are. I need to come to believe in a power greater than myself that can restore me to sanity. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop. And I'm so grateful for everybody that's here. And thank you all for your experience, strength, and hope. And please share it. I love to hear, because there's a lot of people with a lot of recovery here today. And thank you, Dennis, for your service today.